I've been here 6 weeks, but I haven't asked you a question. A question I probably should have asked maybe in my interview process, and that's my mistake. But which gospel do you believe? Did you know there was more than one? They're not all true. And so most are gospel just in name only, but each promises some form of blessedness to its adherents. As we continue our study looking at great stories of the Old Testament, today we are going to be looking at the story of 3 women who each choose to believe and live a different gospel. I think perhaps at first glance their story might seem a little mundane. But my hope for today is that we'll recognize in this story, and hopefully our own stories, that actually nothing is mundane, but that everything is spiritual and extraordinary when we serve a sovereign God. We're going to be looking today at the book of Ruth, and if you don't have a Bible with you and want to follow along, we're going to be going verse by verse, so you can take a Bible from the seat in front of you, and we're going to be on page 222. This morning, again, we're going to start at chapter 1. In chapter 1, even just the first verse is a doozy. And I mean it, like a real doozy. Sometimes a story begins with a line that's meant to really shock you, right? Like get you ready for trouble. Like I can't help but think of Anna Karenina. The first line, happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are all unhappy in their own way. You go, okay, this isn't gonna go well. Or Fahrenheit 451, it was a pleasure to burn. The first verses of the book of Ruth likewise are meant to make you squirm a little bit, to give you the feeling you get from the opening line of Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events. If you're interested in reading stories with happy endings, you would be better off reading some other book. Ruth 1:1 begins, look there with me. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now I realize I didn't see much squirming. Maybe that's because we need a little bit of cultural context there. You see, those first 7 words, in the days when the judges ruled, would have given significant information to the average Israelite to set the scene. The time of the judges was a blot on the history of Israel, characterized by the famous line, if you went to VBS as a kid, maybe you know it, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And clearly, the story of this family is no different. They're from Bethlehem, a town that literally means house of bread because of how fertile the land is. And yet, they're fleeing during a famine to live in Moab. A nation that's known for all kinds of evil. Moab, the product of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moab, where they didn't worship Yahweh, but a god known as Chemosh. And it gets worse. Look at verse 2. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the name of his sons, 2 sons, were Machlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So now this is kind of interesting. I know, we're going slow, but this is interesting. You see, the husband's name is Elimelech, which means my God is king. His wife's name, Naomi, which means pleasant. And their sons' names, Machlon and Chilion, mean deathly and sickly. So some have argued that maybe the author took some creative license here with the sons' names. But either way, you can see the irony, right? Why would a man named God is my king take his family to a land where Chemosh is called king? Why would he abandon his God-given land in the house of bread, Bethlehem, to live in the land of Chemosh? This isn't mundane. This is a spiritual decision. Look at verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. You're supposed to get a whiff of judgment here. Keep reading. These sons took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. So I mentioned earlier, right, that the Moabites were sort of product of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's good to just revisit that story, if you will. As you may know, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by God because of great wickedness. But God sent angels, do you remember this? God sent angels to rescue one family, the most righteous family in Sodom and Gomorrah, the family of Lot, before the cities were destroyed. Lot escaped to a cave with his 2 daughters, and to make a long, very sad and weird story short, they get him drunk, his daughters get him drunk, and rape him to have children. I mean, just take a moment and realize this is the most righteous family in Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how wicked it truly was. And so Lot fathers a child by his daughter, and the child is named Moab, which literally translates, "Who's your daddy?" A constant reminder of their origins. As time goes on, the Moabites are known for all kinds of evil, just like their mother. And so when we see Naomi's sons marry Moabites, we should once again feel terror and hopelessness. The average Israelite would have heard these opening lines and thought, okay, so Mr. God is my king, and his wife, Miss Pleasant, is to be protected and provided for. Now she's to be protected and provided for by her sons Sickly and Deathly, who've married a couple of hussies. What more could go wrong? Verse 5. And both Machlon and Kilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Oh, this is going to be a good story, right? Happy ending on the horizon. No, 3 single women. No husbands, no sons, in a time when typically that would spell out destitution. What was Naomi, a single, middle-aged widow, to do? Let's keep reading. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord, Yahweh, has visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Thus begins the story of 3 gospels, 3 paths: Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. They're soon going to diverge, and my hope is that we will see the true and false gospels exposed in their lives, and maybe hopefully in ours as well. You see, Naomi is going home. The 3 women are all packed up. They've pulled out of the driveway, and they're going down Main Street when it's revealed that Naomi's intentions are different than what was originally expressed. Look at verse 8. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with me and the dead. The Lord grant you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them and they lifted up their voices and wept. See, Naomi knew that they would try to persuade her to stay if she revealed her intentions while they were still home. Now was the opportune time. They're packed and likely not a far walk from their childhood homes. They mourned for their husbands. They took care of their mother-in-law, even though they were under no obligation to do so. Now it's time for them to start over. But the daughters don't agree. Verse 10, and they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." It's a kind offer, right? But Naomi doesn't believe they've truly counted the cost. Look at verse 11. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say that I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." She's saying, listen, there's no hope for you in Bethlehem. It's not worth it. You see, Orpah and Ruth were unkosher Oscar Mayer ladies entering the land of Hebrew National. And so, as Moabites, it took a moment to sink in for some of you. As Moabites, they would have no marriage options, right? Like Deuteronomy 22, 3-4 literally says that no Ammonite or Moabite is allowed to enter into the assembly of the Lord. And it seems harsh, but there's a reason for this. You see, the Moabites historically were actually inhospitable to Israel and sent prophets to go and curse Israel. Maybe you remember the story of Balaam and his talking donkey. Like this is not a good group to get mixed in with. And so Ruth and Orpah would not be welcomed as family. They would be seen as unkosher outsiders. It's here that we should actually relate to Orpah and Ruth. I think though some of us believe that we were born insiders, the Bible actually emphasizes that we're all like Moabites. We're all more like Moabites than we think. It doesn't matter if you were raised in a Christian home or were born Jewish like the Apostle Paul. Romans 5:10 says that we were enemies of God. And Jesus clearly teaches that we are all foreigners of God's grace, in need of new birth, whether you're a Roman centurion, an Ethiopian court marshal, or a Jewish Pharisee like Nicodemus. We're born outsiders. And like Orpah and Ruth, we can't slide into the kingdom. The only hope would be a kinsman redeemer. Someone who could rescue them from their destitution. According to the law in Leviticus, a kinsman redeemer could redeem a person's property, their freedom, and even their name. And this is what Naomi is talking about in verses 12-13. According to Leviticus, and I know this is going to be weird here, people, so just listen to me. According to Leviticus, if a man's brother died childless, if his sister-in-law so desired it, then the brother would do what was necessary so that she might get pregnant and have a child who would redeem the brother's name and provide for her. I know it sounds crazy to us, especially as you think about your brothers and sisters-in-law. Yuck. But this was actually a way in which to help prevent the poverty of widows. In a time before 401ks and IRAs, your children were your retirement package. They were the ones that were going to take care of you. This is God's grace here. But as Naomi explains, in her case, it makes no sense to wait. It makes no sense to put that hope on her. She's old. And even if she did happen to get married and happen to get pregnant at her old age and happen to have boys, they would still need to wait until those boys grew up, and then those boys would need to happen to be into cougars, because by that point, Ruth and Orpah would be much older, right? It just doesn't make sense. Not to mention, this is not a long-awaited homecoming for Naomi. As she's headed back to Bethlehem Ephrathah, she doesn't have Sweet Home Ephrathah playing on her radio. You know, where the skies are so blue, sweet home Ephrathah, Lord, I'm coming home to you. No. The skies are not blue. And she is not a happy guest in the Lord's home. The Lord's against her. I don't want to go back there. There's no reason for you to follow me. Go home. Verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. The speech convinces Orpah, who returns the kiss from verse 9 and heads home. But Ruth clings. This is the first break in the path, the first acceptance of an alternative gospel. You see, nothing is truly mundane, and certainly not this choice. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to Orpah when she got home. Maybe instead of Mr. Deathly and Sickly, she meets Mr. Lively and Healthy. They have 2.5 kids in a nice house with a yard and a dog and a white picket fence. Basically, she might be living the Moabite dream. But with this choice, Orpah misses out on the one thing of true value: a living relationship with Yahweh, the one true God. You see, just like Naomi and Elimelech, when they left the promised land, Orpah chose with her eyes. She heard the prosperity gospel from Naomi that at the end of the day, what matters most is that you get a husband. Be happy and healthy. If there's a higher power, that's what they really want for you. So she opted for what seemed like an offer of health and wealth rather than faith and blessing. But whether she found what she's looking for in Moab really doesn't matter. Either way, she missed what really mattered. She heard that the good news was Moab, where you have a chance of a life of ease. And the bad news was Israel, a daunting path of unfulfilled dreams. Her decision was logical, but it was ruinous. You see, in effect, Naomi convinces Orpah to enter the wide gate by the broad road. As Jesus said in Matthew 7, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Friends, we here in Chicago in 2023 are likewise at risk of following a similar false gospel. One that will surely be peddled to us by countless politicians in the coming months as we enter into an election year. It's the false gospel of the American dream. Similar to the Moabite dream, it tells us to do what we must to get ahead and attain those things that we most desire. To seek our security and significance in the world rather than outside of it. As Pastor David Platt has helpfully put it, while the goal of the gospel is to make much of God, the goal of the American dream is to make much of us. See, we're not so different from Orpah. We'd love to be loyal to Naomi, right? To the people that God has placed in our lives. We'd love to remain loyal to God, but if it means giving up our hopes and dreams, we cross our fingers and hope he'll understand. Orpah's path makes sense to us, but her sister Ruth takes a different path. Look at verse 15. "And Naomi said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.'" Do you hear that? Her people and her gods. Naomi knows that this isn't mundane. This is a spiritual decision. This is an outrage, really, when you think about it. Naomi, an Israelite and supposed Yahweh follower, called to be a light to the nations, tells an eager and potential convert that it's not worth it. That she should follow her sister home to her gods, serve another god. You see, it appears she had a little concern, very little concern for the spiritual condition of her Moabite daughter-in-law. Perhaps Naomi had some superficiality on her side of the relationship. I mean, they were good to her sons, and they were kind to her, but it's time that we all move on. You see, whereas Orpah was convinced by the prosperity gospel, Naomi was living a ubiquitous gospel. How about we just let everyone do their own thing, you know? Like, we can see how Naomi's life situation would have brought her here. Maybe at one point she was a devoted Yahweh follower, but now, after all her suffering, she's easy come, easy go, little high, little low, any way the wind blows, doesn't really matter. Maybe Naomi just assumed her daughter-in-laws wouldn't be interested in her God. I mean, they had Chemosh. Who was she to impose her views of God on her neighbors? I mean, they were good moral people who took good care of her. Did this really matter? Yes, yeah, I know. The Israelites were given the mandate to be the light to the nations, showing the way, but is anyone really doing that? You can imagine all the excuses that Naomi may have come up with not to share with her daughters about Yahweh. But at the end of the day, it's rooted in something else. Perhaps it's because she was no longer a very good Israelite herself. As someone on the run from the land of obedience, she was not eager to defend or explain her faith. Friends, if you find yourself justifying why you don't need to share your faith, it just might be rooted in something else. It's worth to examine. Are there sins or false beliefs that have taken root in your life? Do you believe God is against you? Do you hide your light under a bushel because you're afraid that if you remove it, it'll be exposed for how dim it really is? Or is it possible you simply don't believe it? You hope it's true, right? That you placed your bet on the right religion. But at the end of the day, it's a bet. If it doesn't work out, you've lost a couple hours of your week and some disposable income. Is this your gospel? The gospel of shrugged shoulders and crossed fingers? What Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call a cheap gospel. It seems this was Naomi's gospel. But the true gospel will prevail. Thankfully, God's mission to rescue sinners is not limited by our flaws, failings, and foibles. God will even make use of cheap gospel substitutes to highlight the real, costly, and worthwhile gospel. Look at verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I'll go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." What a speech, am I right? Ruth gets it. She's got nothing to offer. She comes empty, and so she throws herself at the mercy of God. Orpah, she saw her emptiness and turned home to try and fill it. Naomi saw her emptiness and resigned to her circumstances. But Ruth, recognizing her poverty, saw the treasure hidden in the field and gave all that she had for it. She saw the pearl of great price and had to have it. This is the narrow road. It's the way of the cross. This isn't a cheap gospel. It's incredibly costly because it's incredibly worth it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it this way. He said, "Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a person the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price. And what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us." It's not costly. It's costly. It's not cheap. Putting the needs and desires of others before our own. Whether their response is one of gratitude or bitterness. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Nothing, not even death, will part us. And how does Naomi respond? Look at verse 18. "And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more." Silence. Nothing. No tears of joy. No celebration of conversion. Just silence. Fine. It's truly ironic when you think about it that this Moabite widow, Ruth, turns out to show more commitment to Yahweh rather than the Israelite widow. Both widows. Ruth the Moabite pours out her life in the face of bitterness. But friends, this should be no surprise to us. This was also the experience of Jesus. Rejected by the people he came to serve, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He carried that burden all the way to the cross where he died for bitter and hard-hearted unbelievers like us. Nevertheless, the two ladies complete their journey to Bethlehem, and as they enter the town, the women of Bethlehem are filled with excitement, asking, "Is this Naomi?" And so now she breaks her silence. Verse 20, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? No longer call her Naomi. Now it's Mara. Don't call me Miss Pleasant. I am now Miss Bitter." She had to bury her husband and both of her sons in a foreign land. And we can judge Naomi, but recognize she has little hope for survival here. This is a impossible situation. Verse 22, "So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest." So here we are. Bitter Mama Naomi and her loyal daughter Ruth have arrived in Bethlehem. Surely we know that Naomi is not in the right. Her conclusion that God is arbitrarily against her is not true. But what are we to make of this? I regularly read a short story to my kids before they go to bed at night that I just love, by a woman named Ellie Holcomb, called "Don't Forget to Remember." And the last page of the book has this little line on it. It says, "Let the whole earth remind you of what God has said from the moment you wake up till you go to bed. Oh, and even on days you forget what is true, don't forget to remember. God won't forget you." Friends, Naomi may have forgotten God, but God has not forgotten her. Yeah, we can't see it from chapter 1, verse 1. But when we look back from the end of the book, it's significantly more clear. Yahweh wasn't against her. He was taking care of her all along, right? He provided food for his people in Bethlehem to stimulate Naomi to leave Moab and return home. That's chapter 1. He provided Ruth, who wouldn't be deterred by Naomi's faulty logic. And if it weren't for Ruth, Naomi's chances of changing her circumstances would have been completely eliminated. You see, this last verse in the chapter, look there with me, it's verse 22, "And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest," marks the beginning of the reversing of their situation. It's not mundane. If God is truly sovereign, everything is extraordinary. You see, it's through the barley harvest that Ruth just so happens to meet a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be a barley farmer, and just so happens to be a close relative of Naomi, and just so happens to be willing to fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer. He could marry Ruth, and the two women could be provided for. Naomi was done with God, but God wasn't done with her. If we had more time, I'd love to look in depth at the rest of this story, but because my time is almost up, we'll have to take a little shortcut to the end. Boaz and Ruth have a son named Obed. They get married, they have a child. And their son, Obed, has a son named Jesse, who has a son named David, who becomes the king of Israel. And if you know your New Testament, then you know that Jesus, the Messiah, is a direct descendant of David, which makes Ruth the Moabitess and Naomi, the grandchildless widow, great-great-grandmothers of the Messiah, Jesus, who serves as the kinsman redeemer of the world, buying their freedom. Jesus, our willing brother who paid the price for our sin so that we might be free if we turn to him. Listen, maybe you don't see God's plan in your suffering right now. Maybe you were once Mr. God is my king or Miss Pleasant, but now it's all mundane and you can't see how God could possibly redeem your story. William Cowper was an 18th century hymnist who struggled terribly with depression. Really, like he had no idea how it was that God could redeem his life. And so it was at the lowest point of his life, actually after an attempt on his life, that he wrote this song. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. That second stanza is worth repeating. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Maybe you see similar clouds as Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. In our own lives, when we face these clouds, we're often tempted to follow false gospels, to give in to despair. But we need to remember to look above the clouds and see that God is at work. Listen, we may not always understand his purposes or see the immediate results of our faithfulness, but we can trust that he is faithful and he is at work. With Ruth, let's not be swayed by false gospels of worldly success or complacency. Instead, let's cling to the gospel of Jesus Christ, our kinsman redeemer, and know that though there might be clouds, they are big with mercy that shall break in blessings on your head. Would you pray with me? Help us, Lord. Help us to see your mercies, to trust your grace and providence, even when our circumstances seem impossible to redeem. Father, our hope is in your guiding hand. Increase our faith and trust in your plans so that we might see your blessing. Lord, bless us and keep us. We pray